This is the new Citroen C3, and let me tell you straight up that it's quite an unusual car. So I'm going to start this review in an unusual manner by trying to answer this question that has been on my mind since Citroen showed us this car last night. So it's basically their second ever model after the C5 Aircross, which, as you might know, is a luxury SUV, and honestly that's a really good car. So ideally it would have made sense to have another SUV at the budget end of the market, right? Citroen clearly thinks otherwise because this new C3 is not an SUV but, in their own words, a hatchback with a twist. And you know what? There are quite a few twists around the C3. Some really good and some that might not be so convincing for a first-time hatchback buyer. But before we go any further, do check out our recent videos and please consider subscribing to our channel if you like what you see. Back to the C3 and the review. So the big twist here is that Citroen is focusing heavily on ride quality, cabin space, and the sheer number of customization options from the dealership itself. Now, this also means that the features list has taken a back seat, and that's pretty clear once you step inside the C3. So there will be two variants on offer, Live and Feel, and what we have here is the latter, which on paper is the most decked up version of the C3 that you can get before the customization bit begins. But in reality, even this higher grade version, it lacks a lot of the basic features that are now common across B-segment hatchbacks. Although you get a wide 10-inch infotainment system with wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, height adjustment for the driver's seat, and one-touch auto down for all 4 power windows, the C3 lacks basic yet extremely useful features like rear wiper and defogger, a tachometer, split folding rear seats, rear armrest, and a reversing camera. In terms of comfort-oriented features, it's lacking alloy wheels, electric mirrors, push-button start, LED headlamps, and there's no automatic air conditioner either. What's also odd is the placement of rear window switches. Having them between the front seats is hardly convenient, and it also hints at cost-cutting measures. The C3 then is clearly a budget hatch, and when you also consider the fact that it's based on a cost-effective platform and that it'll have over 90% localization for its parts, it's only fair to assume that the pricing is going to be very competitive. The other thing that might work for the C3 is its inoffensive yet very smart design and well-balanced proportions. At nearly 3.9 meters in length and with a wheelbase of over 2.5 meters, the C3 is not only bigger on the outside but also roomier inside compared to most B-segment hatchbacks. And the generous proportions are nicely augmented with the exterior design, which is typically Citroen. The high bonnet, the split design for the headlights, and the grille are all from the C5 Aircross, and so is the generous use of plastic cladding all around. Apart from these, there are some design elements that are unique to the C3. Things like the deeply carved front and rear fenders, sharp grooves on the bonnet, the roof, and lastly, the rather large front skid plate. Now, we don't get to say this often for budget cars, but when it comes to customizing the C3, the sky is the limit. The color options might seem limited at just 4, but then you have 2 roof colors, 2 dashboard colors, and 3 different color packs for the exterior trims, including orange, grey, and chrome. All in all, the combinations are pretty endless, and it's fun to think that you will hardly ever spot 2 similarly spec'd C3 models together. The interior is your typical small car space when it comes to the quality of plastics and textures, but there is nothing typical about the design of the dashboard or the seats. For instance, the large orange colored trim for the dashboard lends it a bespoke feel. Then you have these rounded rectangular shaped air vents and bucket seats at the front with a rather unique pattern to add to the cabin's flair. In comparison, the ambience at the back is a little underwhelming because the cabin is predominantly black and also there is virtually nothing here to keep you occupied. You don't get rear AC vents or even an armrest, but the rear seat itself is large and nicely contoured to hold you in place. We also like the generous amount of legroom and thigh support, which is always a big plus in a small car. The boot at 315 liters is wide enough for 2 check-in size suitcases and 2 handbags, and in terms of volume, it's bigger than the Maruti Swift but noticeably behind something like the Tata Punch. The first thing that strikes you as soon as you start driving the C3 is the driving position itself. I mean, you sit very high, the steering wheel is just the right size, and visibility up front is superb because of how low the windscreen extends and how the dashboard is angled. So you get a great view of the road ahead. And because you have these ridges on top of the bonnet, you get a better understanding and judgment of where it ends, which is always good for new drivers. Visibility from the side windows is also great, although parking the C3 is always going to require more effort than usual because of the lack of reversing camera and a relatively smaller rear glass. As for the engine itself, what we have here is the turbocharged version of the 1.2 litre 3-cylinder petrol engine, and it's paired to a 6-speed manual gearbox. Now the C3 can also be had with a naturally aspirated version of this engine with a 5-speed manual, but obviously it's down on power. But strangely enough, there is no automatic option at the moment, even for this 110 horsepower version, which I think is quite delightful. I mean, it pulls well from low to mid RPMs, and besides a clattery idle, it's good on refinement as well. I mean, there is hardly any engine noise or vibrations to be felt. The C3 is surprisingly quick in a straight line, delivering effortless performance all the way till triple-digit speeds. The typical 3-cylinder engine thrum is also well contained, and under normal driving conditions, this 1.2 litre engine remains adequately quiet and refined. The 6-speed manual that we have here isn't the most engaging unit around, but for everyday driving it's good enough. Although what's even better is the clutch action. It's light, but again it's not as feather light as the one we have seen on the Tata Punch, but it's very progressive, and that's just perfect for city driving. The other thing that makes the C3 so user-friendly is the steering and its lightness. The wheel itself is quite compact compared to other hatchbacks, and in terms of usability, it's nearly spot on. Firstly, it operates with just the right amount of progression as you turn, and more crucially, it's very light at parking speeds, and that's something that a lot of first-time car buyers would appreciate. Now, ride quality is something that has always been Citroen's forte, and we have experienced that extensively in the C5 Aircross SUV. Naturally, the much cheaper C3 doesn't have the same level of plushness, but for a hatchback, it's a different story altogether. Firstly, the suspension on this car is extremely silent, and until or unless you go over the biggest of potholes or speed breaker, you won't even hear it working. And secondly, it's also good at absorbing bumps and keeping the car flat over bad roads. The 195 section tires are among the widest that we have seen in B segment hatchbacks, and it's the combination of these chunky tires, 180mm ground clearance and long travel suspension that plays a key role in delivering a big car like ride quality. Citroën themselves have said that the C3 is not an SUV, but it has the attributes of an SUV. And that brings us to the other pressing question that I have around the C3 and its identity. Now, I'll be honest, it has been a little difficult to sum up my thoughts on the C3 given the limited time that we have had today. So what we know for sure is that it's got a spacious cabin and that there's a huge scope for customization. It also rides really well for a basic hatchback, but that's the thing. It's just a nice basic hatchback, and in a market like ours where features are so important, the C3 I feel will have its work cut out because it's not only lacking gimmicky features but also a lot of the basic stuff that we have come to expect from hatchbacks. It's a cheerful car for sure, but will the C3 be cheap? Well, that's purely down to how well Citroën India does for pricing, and given its size and the list of standard features, the C3 is likely to be a very affordable proposition. We are expecting that the C3 would undercut petrol manual versions of the Swift, the Celerio and the Punch, which means a starting price of little over Rs 5 lakhs for the naturally aspirated C3. If Citroen can deliver on that, then there is a good chance for them to taste success with their first ever budget car for India. We will have to wait till 20th of July because that's when Citroen will officially launch the C3 along with prices for the entire range. So stay tuned and do consider subscribing to our channel if you would like to see more of budget car content.